The global energy transition is not a policy choice. It is a massive transfer of systemic leverage from the oil fields of the Middle East to a single high-altitude desert where the next 100 years of economic sovereignty are currently being auctioned to the highest bidder. Because in 2026, the nation that owns the Lithium triangle doesn't just own the market, they own the future. This is the Salar de Uyuni. To a tourist, it's a mirror. To a strategist, it is a civilization-scale kill switch. We are witnessing the rise of Li-PEC, the world's first lithium cartel. How did the US use a Trojan horse treaty to build a high-altitude embargo against Chinese industry? Why are global superpowers sacrificing private giants like Tesla and SQM for total state control? Will a new South American cartel break the petrodollar and dictate the price of your digital life? Can a decapitation strike in extraction technology bankrupt the West before the race even truly begins? Is the world building a lithium shield that forces nations to choose between their energy and their internet? Who actually wins the war for global control? The ones with the reserves, the ones with the factories, or the ones with the capital? Let's uncover what's really going on. In the early 20th century, the Seven Sisters, a group of Western oil companies, dictated the fate of nations. Today, we have a new set of sisters: Albemarle, SQM, Ganfeng, Tianqi, and Mineral Resources. But unlike the oil age, these corporate giants are being swallowed by the states they operate in. We are at that exact moment again where the leverage shifts back to the source. But this time, the resource isn't liquid. It's a white metallic powder found in the brine of the Andes. To understand the future of money and power, you must understand the lithium triangle. Let's look at the mechanics of the 2026 shadow war. Argentina has become the US Trojan horse. On February 4th, 2026, in Washington, the United States and Argentina signed a reciprocal trade and investment agreement. This deal was negotiated in record time, driven by the alignment between the Trump and Milei administrations. While the title says reciprocity, the reality is a fiction. The US removed 10% tariffs on 1,600 Argentine products. In exchange, Argentina committed to the RIGI, the incentives regime for large investments. The RIGI isn't just a tax break, it's a mega protection treaty. Argentina is now obligated to coordinate its export controls with US national security policies. This is a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. If Washington decides a certain type of lithium battery is a national security risk because it contains Chinese software, Argentina must stop exporting the raw materials to China. This is the weaponization of the supply chain. It is a high-altitude embargo, enforced not by ships, but by contracts. But while Washington secures Argentina, Beijing has already fortified Bolivia. China's CATL consortium, the largest battery maker on Earth, holds the keys to the world's largest reserves: 23 million tons of white gold. China didn't just buy the lithium, they built the roads, the space facilities, and the fiber optic cables that now tether La Paz to Beijing. Bolivia is no longer just a country, it is a Chinese industrial colony. China's CATL isn't just a battery maker, it is a geopolitical weapon. In Bolivia, they aren't building ponds, they are building modular DLE units. These units can be moved, scaled, and hidden. By 2028, they aim to produce 100,000 tons of battery-grade carbonate. This is how you win a war without firing a shot. You own the chemical process that powers the enemy's economy. Now, Watch the corporate proxy war, Tesla versus BYD. This is the defining rivalry of our age. In Chile, the government's national lithium strategy has fundamentally altered the landscape. On January 27, 2026, the state-owned Codelco created Nova Andino Litio. This new entity is a state-led monster, valued at $7.5 billion.
Money and power require movement. Every gram of lithium must pass through specific Andean ports like Antofagasta. If the lithium cartel, Chile, Argentina and Bolivia, coordinates production quotas, the just-in-time manufacturing of the world's tech giants will collapse in days. But there is a hidden cost, a technical bottleneck: direct lithium extraction, or DLE. Traditional evaporation ponds take 18 to 24 months to produce lithium. But in 2026, DLE has moved from pilot to commercial scale. Whoever perfects DLE first wins the 21st century. In Bolivia, Russian and Chinese consortiums are deploying DLE plants, aiming for 100,000 tons by 2028. If they succeed, they will flood the market and bankrupt every Western mining company still relying on slow evaporation. We must also talk about the digital Silk Road. In 2026, the war for lithium is inseparable from the war for data. Chile's proposed trans-Pacific fiber optic cable to Hong Kong was the flashpoint. The US blocked it. Why? Because whoever controls the cable controls the flow of information between the lithium triangle and the Chinese manufacturing hubs. This is the silicon shield in reverse. Now, a lithium shield is being built around South America. If you want the powder, you have to accept the Western internet. And then there is the white oil curse. To produce 1 ton of lithium using old methods, you need 500,000 gallons of water. This is a death sentence for indigenous ecosystems. We are already seeing water riots in the Atacama. So, who is winning this war for global control? If you measure by reserves, the winner is Bolivia. If you measure by infrastructure, the winner is China. If you measure by capital, the winner is the United States. But the real winners are the nations of the triangle themselves. They know that in 2026, the world cannot move without them. A self-powered, price-setting lithium cartel is the greatest threat to the current global order. It would break the petrodollar. This is Capitoria. Subscribe to stay ahead of the system.